Masechet Kiddushin Daf Ayin Zayin Nu Mishnah Bat Halal Zachar Pisula Mina Kehuna Leolam. If you have a man who is a halal, an invalid kohen, and he marries even a kosher person, a kosher woman, the daughter it will be will not be able to marry a kohen. So that's not good. A halal is going to pass on that invalid gene to a daughter. Yisrael shenasa halala bito keshera lichuna. On the other hand, if she is a halala, and so she can't marry a kohen, but let's say she marries a Yisrael, that is not hereditary. Her daughter can marry a kehuna, a kohen. And now we repeat the first law. Halal shenasa bat Yisrael bito pesulach lichuna. A man who's a halal who marries a kosher Jewish woman, the daughter cannot marry a kohen. The Gemara is going to ask why we repeat the law in the beginning over here. It's going to answer it's really just for stylistic parallelism. Since you mentioned here Yisrael shenasa, so we want to say halal shenasa. We're not going to learn anything new from it, but it's really the same thing. Okay, so the point is that a male halal passes on that flaw to a child. A female halala does not pass on that gene to a child. The Rabbi Yehuda Omer bat ger zachar kebat halal zachar. Rabbi Yehuda comes and adds that the daughter of a man who's a convert has the same law as the daughter of a man who's a halal, meaning it does pass on that prohibition to marry a kohen. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Yisrael shenasa giyoret bito keshera lechuna, veger shenasa bat Yisrael bito keshera lechuna, aval ger shenasa giyoret bito pesula lechuna. He says that if a kosher Jew marries a convert woman, the daughter can marry a kohen. Doesn't pass on the giyoret flaw. And on the other hand, same thing, a male who's a convert that marries a kosher Jewish woman, the daughter also can marry a kohen. Does not pass on the conversion flaw. So when does the conversion flaw get passed? Only when both parents are converts. Both the man and the woman are converts and they have a daughter. Only then is the daughter the child of a convert and cannot marry a kohen. Rabbi Eliezer continues and says, "Echad ger ve'echad abadim meshuchrarim afilu ad asara dorot ad shetei imo miYisrael." Now, when it gets passed down, meaning if both parents are gerim, it gets passed down not just one generation, but even up to even 10 generations, really even more. This applies to a ger and to a slave, a Eved Kana'ani, who is freed, who is basically the same as a convert. As long as both parents are converts, it will go on forever, unless one of the mother is Yisrael. In fact, if we're reading this as the continuation of Rabbi Eliezer, it means either the father or the mother is Jewish, then that will stop the continuity of this flaw. Rabbi Yosef Omer af ger shenasa giyoret bito keshera lechuna. Rabbi Yosef is even more lenient, and he says even if it's a convert that marries another convert, the daughter can marry a kohen. Good. Mai le'olam. We ask about the first opinion here that a father who is a halal, the daughter will be prohibited to marry a kohen forever. Well, why do you have to say that forever? I might have thought that this law of the passing down of halal to next generation would be the same as a convert from an Egyptian or a convert from an Edomite, where there the prohibition is only for the first couple of generations, but after 3 generations is permitted. So I might think that here also the halal will go on for 2 generations, but maybe by the 3rd and later it's permitted. That's why I have to say le'olam, a halal status will be passed on to children forever. Yisrael shenasa halala. Now, if the mother is a halala, we said it does not get passed down to the daughter. The daughter can marry a kohen. How's the source? Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ne'emar kan lo yechalel zar'o be'amav ne'emar lehalan lo yitama ba'al be'amav ma lehalan zecharim velo nekebot avkan zecharim velo nekebot. So Rabbi Yochanan says name Rabbi Shimon. We're going to learn it from the Kohen Gadol pasuk. It's right here It says that a Kohen Gadol has to betula be'amav yikach isha, he cannot marry almana ugrusha. And if he does, he has to do that in order that lo yechalel zar'o be'amav, so that this offspring will not become halalim. So this is the main place that we learn the laws of that halal is a hereditary trait. And so a Kohen has to do this so that the kids won't be a halal. That means if a Kohen Gadol does marry someone he's not allowed to, then his kids will be a halal. That's the main source. And now that's what it says in 21:15. In that same Perek in Vayikra, it also says that a Kohen is prohibited from becoming Tameh Lamet except for close relatives. Now, regarding Tumah, we know that applies only to male Kohanim and not to a Bat Kohen. A Bat Kohen can go and she can become Tameh Lamet like anybody else. She doesn't have this prohibition. So too, regarding this law about passing on halal status to a child, that applies only to men. Only a halal will pass on that to a daughter, but a mother who is a halalah will not pass it on to a daughter. So this is a gezer hashava. They're not exactly the same words, but be'amav, and lo. So they're similar, and therefore we learned that from the other. So that's how you know that a halalah does not pass on the unfit status to her daughter. Well, that it means, according to that, even for a Kohen Gadol who enters into a prohibited marriage, marries an almanah, even for him, his daughter would be permitted to marry a Kohen. Can that be? Mikati beno? No, it's not true for a Kohen Gadol. He's an exception, because there it doesn't say lo yechalel beno. It says zar'o ketib, lo yechalel zar'o be'amav, right? And zar'o includes all of his children. So for a Kohen Gadol, his daughter, in fact, will become unfit. Not different from a regular halalah who does not pass on the halalah status to her daughter. Now, bat beno tishtere. Now, what about the son's daughter? He has a son. The son will be a halal. And what if that son of the Kohen Gadol has a daughter? She be permitted? The answer is no. Ketiv lo yichalel zad'o, makis zad'o lo. Mahu bito pisula, af beno bito pisula. Since it says that the Kohen Gadol's offspring will be halal, and so we're comparing zad'o, his zera, we're comparing the Kohen Gadol to his son. Just like the Kohen Gadol's daughter will become unfit, so too his son's daughter will also become unfit. Good. Bat bito titasar. Well, in that case, so then it should be passed on to the Kohen Gadol's daughter's daughter also, right? No. Imken gezerah shava mayahanile. The gezerah shava before that we had regarding become tameh lamet, that applies only to men and not women. So too, for this law, halala is passed on by a halal, not by a halala. Well, so what would be the point of that, gezerah shava, if you're going to let it pass down 2 generations, even on the daughter's line? So therefore, this is no, that's not true. So therefore, for a regular halala, it doesn't get passed down to a daughter at all. But for a Kohen Gadol, it does get passed down to a daughter or to a son's daughter, but only for that one but not to a daughter's daughter. Okay, halal shenasa bat Yisrael bito pesula. The Mishnah teaches further that a male halal that marries a kosher Jew, the daughter is pesula, meaning the father passes on the halal status to a daughter. Hatana leresha. Wait a second, this is the same as the first line in the Mishnah. The first and third line are the same. But halal zachar pisula mina keuna leolam. It says over there the same thing, that a halal who's a male, his daughter cannot marry a kohen forever. Aidi the tanaresha yisrael shenasa halala tanana mesefa halal shenasa bat Yisrael. You're right, it is the same, but since in the second line, it says something about Yisrael marrying a halala, so we wanted to fill in the parallelism and say, and the other way around, halal that marries bat Yisrael, switches around the male and the female roles here. This Mishnah disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Dostai ben Yehuda. Detanya Rabbi Dostai ben Yehuda Omer, Keshem she'bnei Yisrael mikveh tahara la'chalalot, kach benot Yisrael mikveh tahara la'halalim. He says, just like the kosher men are like a mikveh and help make tahor halalot, This is true. Everybody agrees to that in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah, the beginning of the Mishnah agrees to it, because Mishnah said that halala, married to a kosher Jew, does not get passed down to the next generation. So that part of it is agreed upon. But Rabbi Yostai says the other way around also, that Benot Yisrael, a kosher woman, Jew, is a mikveh tara to male halalim, meaning that the male halal, if he marries a kosher Jew, it will not get passed down, according to the Bidostai. Whereas the Tanakh, our Mishnah, says it does get passed down. Now, my Tameh de Bidostai b'Rabbi, what's his source for being more lenient here? Amar kela lo yichalel zar'o be'amav be'am echad hu demechel b'shnei amamim eno mechel. It's from that very same pasuk regarding the Kohen Gadol. It says the Kohen Gadol should not do this so that his zera will not become halalim. Now it says, but it's be'amav. Be'amav means if it's one nation here being taken to mean one type, meaning both halalim. If both the father and mother are the same, have the same definition, halal, married to a halala, then the child will be a halal, then it'll be mechel. But if the parents are two, again, not two literally different nations, but rather one is a halal and one's not, either way, either the man is kosher or the mother is kosher, then the child will not be a halal. So that's, he learns it also from Kohen Gadol, and is therefore more lenient. Tenor Banan, lo yechalel zar'o, en li ela zar'o, hi atzma minayin. The Baraita quotes the same pasuk regarding the Kohen Gadol, and says, okay, I see it clearly tells me that his offspring will become halalim, but what about the wife herself? The wife, let's say she was a girusha and she marries a Kohen Gadol. So I understand that the child will be a problem, but what about she herself? How do I know that she, after that, let's say he dies, cannot go ahead and marry a Kohen? Amarta kavachomer. Mazaro shelo avar avera mitchalel, hishav ravero, edon din shemitchalelet. I can learn it from a kavachomer. If the child that did no sin, it just was born, happened to be born from a prohibited marriage, it didn't do anything wrong, and yet it becomes halal. So she, who did a sin, she was not allowed to marry this Kohen, all the more so that she should become a halala. Hu atzmo yochiach. Wait, we can reject this kal vachomer from the status of the guy, the Kohen. Sharavar verave en mitchalel. A Kohen does not become a halal by entering a prohibited marriage. It's true, while he's married, he cannot serve in the Bet HaMikdash, but once he divorces her and swears he's not going to go back and get any hana'ah from her, then he can go back to being a kosher Kohen. So you could say, well, if he doesn't become a halal, maybe she shouldn't become a halala either. She shouldn't become unfit to marry a Kohen either. No, but you can't compare them because the law is stringent in general for her more than him. A Kohen does not become a halal in all cases of prohibited relations, whereas for her, she becomes prohibited, she becomes a halala. Any type of prohibited relation that a woman has makes her into the status of a zonah, and therefore cannot marry a Kohen. So since the law is more stringent for her, in general, it will be more stringent for her in here also, and you can't bring me the exception of the Kohen himself. Okay, that's one way to learn it from a kal vachomer. And then we say, if you don't like that kal vachomer for some reason, I have another way to derive the law. Since it says yechalel, like to become a halal, lo yechulal, to become profaned, has to be referring to someone who was kosher and became profaned. That can't be talking about the child, because the child is born already as a halal or halala. The child doesn't become a halal. So it must be referring to someone else. Who else would that be? It would be the mother who was kosher and now becomes a halal. Now we ask, what was wrong with the kal vachomer that you said, if you don't like the kal vachomer, I'll bring you another one? Well, here's a possible refutation of that kal vachomer. You might reject the Kal Vachomer and say that even though the child didn't make any sin, still it was created from a sin, and maybe that's why it becomes a halal, whereas the mother was not created in sin. She was kosher, so she should not become a halal. She was not created in sin. You might think that that's the main point, and that would reject the Kal Vachomer. Since it's possible to reject the Kal Vachomer, if you want, I'll bring you a different derivation. Since it says lo yechalel, lo yichulal is talking about someone who was kosher and becomes a halal. So that's a second alternate derivation. Now that we mentioned those two derivations, that a woman who was kosher can become a halala by entering into a prohibited marriage, we're going to quote a baraita that is going to distinguish between women that become a halala and women that are born as a halala, which the Torah mentions directly, that you don't have to derive. Tenura banan, ezohi halala. We're going to go through a few iterations of the exact language of this baraita. So yes, what is a halala? Kol shenoda mina pisulim. Anyone who's born from someone with flawed lineage. Sounds like any flawed lineage. Now, my pisulim. Now, what do you mean by flawed lineage? Ela mi'ilema pisulim law, that it's a flawed lineage for him, a woman that has some kind of problem with a particular guy. This is not true, because, for example, if a man divorces a woman and then she gets married to someone else, and then they get remarried, that's a problem. You're not allowed to bring back to marry again with someone who you had divorced. If she marries someone in between, if it's a kohen, can't, not even, then she's also a gerusha, even if there's nobody in between. But even for Israel, if she married someone in between, she can't go back to her first husband. Even though she is prohibited to this guy, but the children in such a case are kosher. The pasuk says that is a abomination. That means only she is an abomination. That's a problem for her. She can't marry a kohen once she does that, but it does not get passed on to the children. So this is not a case of someone who's born. So this is not true that anyone who's born as from pisulim is a halala. Here's someone who's born of pisulim, and yet the child is not a halal. So that can't be that. Amar Rav Yehuda, Hachika Amar. Rav Yehuda says, no, here's the right language of the Braita. Ezui chalala, kol shenoda mina pisul lekehuna. Means, who is a chalala? Anyone who's born from someone who is unfit to be a kohen. Not just pasul in general, but pasul as a kohen. Now, we ask, noda in, lo noda lo. Wait, the only way to become a chalala is if you're born that way, but if you're not born that way, there's no way to become a chalala. Hare almana grusha zona, de lo noda vekav ya chalala. And almana and gerusha and zona, these are all people, these three women, that are fine, they're born kosher, but once they become a widow or a divorcee, or she engages in activity that makes her a zona, then she becomes a halala. They're not born that way, but they become a halala. So that can't be what the Baraita is saying. Amar Rabba, third try, hachika amar ezo halala muskeret shelo haya lal shat hakosher kelal kol shenoda min pasul kehuna. What is a chala that's mentioned? We're going to explain that mention means mentioned in the Torah explicitly, that never had a time when she was kosher at all, but rather she was born as a halala. The answer is anyone who was born from someone someone who was unfit to kehuna. If someone's on kehuna has a child, that child will be a halala. That's someone who was born as a halala. Good. My muskeret. Now we're just going to explain what does it mean muskeret. Mention where. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Ravin hachikamad ezohi chalala sheikara midivrei Torah ve'en srichin lefaresh midivrei sofrim kol shenoda min pesule kehuna. There's another reformulation, and this one seems like it doesn't actually need to change the wording, but it's explaining what the word muskeret means, right? Where do you have a chalala that is essential in the Torah? It's explicit in the Torah. It does not need to be learned from a derasha like a kal vachomer that we had before. Midivrei sofrim. What's something that's explicit? Oh, anyone who is born from someone unfit to be a kohen, that for sure will make her born as a halala. We next have a fascinating baraita about a Kohen Gadol who sins multiple times. How many punishments does he get? Tenorabanan, almana, 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 eno chayav ela achat. If a Kohen Gadol has relations with an almana 3 times, or is it talking about 3 different almanot? We're going to have to see it in the discussion. Let's say 3 different almanot. He only is liable lashes 1 time. We'll see why. Girusha, 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 eno chayav ela achat. If he has this could be a Kohen Gadol or a regular Kohen, is prohibited to a Girusha. If he has relations with a Girusha and then another, he is liable lashes only 1 time. Almana u'Girusha v'halala zona, bizman she'en kaseder chayav al kol achat ve'achat. Zinta v'nitchalela v'nitkarasha v'nitarmela, eno chayav ela achat. If a Kohen Gadol has relations with with a woman who is first an almana, so she's a woman, she got widowed, and then the same woman got married again and then was divorced, and the same woman then became a chalala, and then she acted in a way that made her a zona, and the Kohen Gadol has relations with this woman. If she had all these occurrences in this order, that first she became ana and then girusha and so on, then that Kohen Gadol is liable to lashes for each and every one of these 4 times lashes. This phrase is a quote from the Torah. Amana girusha v'chalala zona. That's in the Torah itself. So if it's in that order, he's liable 4 times. But if it's in the opposite order, let's say, first she did an act that made her a zona, and then she became a halala, and then she became a divorcee, and then she became a widow, and a Kohen Gadol has relations with that woman, then he is liable only 1 time. All right, we have a lot of explaining to do. Amar mor, almana, 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 eno chayav ela achat. Hay almana hechidameh. Ilema sheba al almanat Reuven, v'al almanat Shimon, v'al almanat Levi, amayeno chayav ela achat. So the Baraita mentioned that almanat 3 times, and the Kohen Gadol has relations, and he's liable only once. What are we talking about? If it's talking about a case where the Kohen Gadol had relations with the widow of Reuven, and then a different woman, someone who was widowed from a guy named Shimon, and then a third woman who was widowed from Levi. So why is he liable only 1 time? Harei gufin muchlakin, harei shemot muchlakin. These are 3 different bodies, meaning 3 different people, and 3 different prohibitions. Actually, they're all the same prohibition of almana, but it's related to 3 different people. So therefore, 3 different people, it's 3 different prohibitions. He should be liable to 3 sets of lashes. Why only 1? So it can't be that case. Ela sheba almana achat shalosh biot. Rather, it's 1 almana, and he had the relations with her 3 times. Okay, is that the case? Well, hechidame, subdivision, what's the case within that? If they only gave him witnesses, in order to give someone punishment, there have to be witnesses, and the witnesses have to give him a warning. So if they only gave him a warning once in the beginning, and then he had relations 3 times, the warning only counts for the first one. The law is that a warning has to be within a few seconds of the act, enough time to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi, which is, do you see why capital punishment and corporeal punishments basically never happened, because you'd have to have 2 witnesses see it, say, hey, don't you know? If you do this, you're going to get lashes. And he says, yeah, I know. And then he has to go and do the act within the time that it takes to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi. If he waits 10 seconds and then does it, no punishment. Therefore, in this case, if this Kohen Gadol had relations 3 times, but he was only warned once, then that's obvious that he would only get 1 set of lashes, and the Baraita wouldn't even bother to tell us such a case. So it can't be that that's the case, that there was only 1 warning. Ela datru bek al kol hada v'hada, amay eno chayav ela achat. Rather, so is it that they gave him a warning 3 times? If so, then he should be liable 3 times lashes, right? Because for every warning and sin, another act of that's another sin, another liability to lashes, as we see here. V'hatenan nazir shaya shote yain kol hayom kulo eno chayav ela achat. Amru lo al tishte v'hu shote chayav al kol achat ve'achat. A Mishnah Nazir says that if a Nazir is drinking wine all day long, and he's warned at the beginning of the day. You have to be warned to get a punishment. So they warn him at the beginning of the day, and then he's continuing drinking wine all day long. He only gets lashes once because he was only warned one time. But if in the middle, they warn him in the beginning of the day, and then they warn him again in the middle of the day, and then they warn him again in the afternoon, and he drinks after each time that he's warned, he's going to be liable to lashes for every single act that he does, every sin that he does after the warning. So if it's the case that they warned him multiple times, then he would be required multiple lashes. But this Baraita said only one. So that can't be the case either. It's rather, La Sricha Shebal Manat Reuven, Shaital Manat Shimon, Shaital Manat Levi. In fact, we're talking about one woman and one act of relations between the Kohen Gadol and the one woman. The Chidush, however, is that this one woman was 3 times widowed. Was a black widow. She married Reuven, he died. She married Shimon and he died. She married Levi and he died. So she has 3 almanah statuses upon her. I might have thought that there are 3 separate prohibitions. So therefore, if a Kohen Gadol has relations with her, I might have thought that he's liable for lashes 3 times because she has 3 statuses as an almanah, and he's liable for all 3. And therefore, this Baraita teaches us that's not so. It doesn't matter how many times she was widowed. A widow is a widow. It doesn't matter if it's once or 10 times. In order to be liable multiple times, has to be different bodies, different people, different almanot. Then he would be liable more than once. But one person, one sin per person. Okay, that's the beginning of the Braita. Now we continue to explain the rest of the Braita. Almana grusha v'halala zona. Again, one woman. See, this makes sense. So now the Braita is consistent. Both the Resha and the Sefer are talking about one woman who is an almana 3 times, or she is divorced 3 times. There, only one set of lashes. But here, if the same woman becomes an almana, then girusha, then halala, then zona, he's liable for each of them. Haitana mai kasabar. I kasabar isur halal isur ipechaname. I kasabar en isur halal isur afilu kaseder namila. So this Tana, what does he think? In Jed, there's a machloket. We're going to see the source of the machloket in a minute. About whether you can have one prohibition take effect on another prohibition. For example, if someone eats non-kosher food on Yom Kippur, so it's already not kosher, so it was already liable, it's already prohibited to him. So can the prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur apply again, and he's liable to 2 things? Right, we're going to see that machloket. So if the Tana of this Baraita thinks that, yes, a prohibition can take effect upon another prohibition, then what's the difference what the order is? Why would it be that in this order, he's liable 4 times? But if the woman became a zonah first, then chala, then girusha, then almana, then not so, only 1. If a prohibition takes effect upon another prohibition, then it shouldn't matter. And if our Tana thinks that one prohibition cannot take effect on another prohibition, then it also doesn't matter which order. And this order also should be liable only once. She's already an almana, and that's it. So there's already prohibition. Girusha should not be able to apply upon it, and either order should be only once. So in what reality would it make a difference if it's in one order but not the other? Amar Rava, haytana isur halal isur letle isur mosif itle. Rava explains. Our Tana thinks that if it's the same prohibition, the same type of prohibition, or the same expanse of that prohibition, it applies to the same number of people in the same way, then no, the one prohibition will not apply to another. But if the second prohibition is more expansive than the first, that is, it applies to more people than the first one, so since it's a bigger thing, it covers over the first one, and it applies in addition to the first one. So here's how it works in the order that one is liable 4 times. This woman, let's say she becomes an almana first. And so at that point, she's prohibited only to a Kohen Gadol, but an almana can marry anyone else, even a regular Kohen. And then, Havyala Gerusha, she becomes the divorcee. Now she becomes prohibited also to a regular Kohen. Certainly this has to apply. You can't say that she's not considered Girusha. Of course she's considered Girusha, because now more people are prohibited to her. Since more people are prohibited to her, so that prohibition is going to be added on. Also, if a Kohen Gadol would have relations with her at that point, then he would be liable twice as Almana and Girusha. But this woman could still eat Teruma. So what? She's a Girusha. Girusha can eat Teruma. She goes back to her father's house as a bat kohen. But if she then becomes a halala, so now there's another prohibition that applies to her. It has to apply to her because before she could eat teruma, now she can't. So this is a new one. Since a new prohibition applies to her, for reasons of teruma, it also applies regarding Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol will now be liable 3 times. Ela zona ma isur mosif ba it ba. But if she then becomes a zona, what is that adding? She's already prohibited to any Kohen and to teruma. Amar Rav Chana bar Rav Kitina ho'il v'shem zinut posel b'Yisrael. Oh, the answer is zona. One of the ways to become a zona is by adultery, and if she is an adulteress, then she'll be prohibited to go back and be with her own husband. So that is yet another, a more expansive prohibition, and so therefore all 4 apply. Even according to the opinion that says en isur chal al isur, but if each one's more expansive, then yes. On the other hand, if you go the other way around, then not so, because zona would already make her prohibited to Yisrael and Kohen Gadol, and then the other ones backwards would not add anything further. She becomes an almana last. Well, becoming an almana, she was already prohibited to a Kohen Gadol. So her becoming an almana doesn't add a prohibition upon anyone who wasn't already prohibited, and therefore, if you go in the opposite order, she is liable only once. Taneh Tana Kamed Rav Sheshat Kol shehu be'yikach harehu be'lo yikach Kol she'eno be'yikach eno be'lo yikach Pirat lekohen gadol sheba al achoto almana. Okay, this is pretty simple halacha, just said in a cryptic way. We're talking about this pasuk here. Amana grusha v'chalala zona ele lo yikach. This is a kohen gadol cannot marry any of these people. That's the phrase that we saw before. Amana grusha v'chalala zona. He cannot take. But betula yikach, he can take. So the Rav Sheshat teaches anyone who can be taken, meaning is marriageable to a kohen, can become prohibited to him, and then have that prohibition, and then they would be liable if they did it. But if you have someone who never was capable of marrying the Kohen Gadol, then the other prohibitions of Almana Girusha will not be added on in addition to it. Okay, the example is clearer. A Kohen Gadol who has relations with his own sister, who is also an almana. Now, every a brother and sister are prohibited from birth. That's irva. That's basic law. So the Kohen Gadol was always prohibited to his sister, and therefore she was never included in yikach. Even if she's a betula, Kohen Gadol will not be allowed to marry her. So since she's already prohibited to him, when she becomes an almana, that almana status doesn't add any extra prohibition to her, right? Lo yikach will not apply to his own sister. So therefore he'd be liable for being with his sister. He would not be liable for the prohibition of almana. Now, this halacha was actually told to Rav Sheshat by a Tana, by a professional memorizer. He says, listen, I have this baraita, I memorized, and he presents it to Rav Sheshat. Rav Sheshat responds, Amar le, damar lach maneh, Rabbi Shimon, damar en isur hal al isur. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon omer, ha'ochel nebela b'yom kippurim, patur, dira banan ha'amri, isur hal al isur. So Rav Sheshat, who told told you this, right? Who is the author of this baraita? And the answer is, it must be Rabbi Shimon, who says one prohibition does not apply to another prohibition. As Rabbi Shimon said in a baraita, someone who eats nevela, non-kosher meat, if you eat non-kosher meat, nevela, one is chayav karet, and you eat it on Yom Kippur. Someone who eats on Yom Kippur, not if they're sick and all that, but if they're on purpose, they go and eat and violate Yom Kippur, isur is karet. Someone who eats nebela meat on Yom Kippur, patur, he's only liable for the nebela, one prohibition. He's not liable also for eating on Yom Kippur, because it's the same prohibition, and so it does not apply to the other one. So it has to be that we're following Rabbi Shimon, because if it was Rabbanan say that one prohibition is added on to another. According to Rabbanan, one would be liable 2 times if he ate nebela on Yom Kippur. So therefore, in this case, you have a sister, Kohen Gadol's sister, who's an almana, and the law is, the Baraita says he is liable only for sister, not for almana prohibition, so only one must be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. But then we say not necessarily. We don't want the Baraita to be only one. Can we fit it in with Rabbanan? Yes. Afilu tema Rabbanan. Ki amri Rabbanan isur hal al isur, hanemele isur hamur al isur kal, aval isur kal al isur hamur la hayil. The Baraita can be the opinion of Rabbanan. When Rabbanan say that one prohibition does apply to another, that's if the second prohibition is more stringent than the first. It would apply here also when they're equal prohibitions. So equal or greater, the second one is greater, then it will apply to the first one. But if the second one is less stringent than the first, then it does not apply. In this case, the Kohen Gadol is prohibited to his sister by Isur Karet, from the time that they're born. That's stringent. The prohibition of a Kohen Gadol to an Almanah is merely a lav. That's less. So even Rabbanan would agree that if you have the sister prohibition first, which it is first, and then the Almanah prohibition, even though in general Isur Chalal Isur, but if the second one is lighter, it does not apply. So this Baraita can also be the opinion of Rabbanan. Another version of this that discussion, Ika Damre, Ha Mane Rabbanan Hi Damre Isur Hal Al Isur. This Baraita that says the Kohen Gadol is liable only for the sister prohibition, not for Almanah. This is the opinion of Rabbanan, who say that one prohibition is added onto the other, and nevertheless over here he's liable only one, because they only apply the second one if it's greater than the first one. But if the second one is lighter than the first one, as it is here, Almanah on top of Achot, it does not apply. And the Baraita cannot be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, because it will be too obvious. If Rabbi Shimon says that even a stringent prohibition cannot apply to a pre-existing lenient prohibition, then all the more so that a lenient one cannot apply to a stringent one. So if, according to Rabbi Shimon, Yom Kippur will not apply to Nevela, well, those are equal, certainly, and does not apply, the second one does not apply, certainly when the second one is lighter, it will also not apply. So it'll be obvious, I wouldn't even have to say it. And then we answer, no, not necessarily. It could be that this is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and we need to say the chidush because I might have thought that the prohibitions regarding kohanim are different. Kohanim have a lot of stringencies that aren't around and don't apply to other people in other cases. So I might have thought that since it's isur kehuna, maybe here, yes, lighter prohibition of almanah can apply to the prohibition of upon a sister. And so that's why Rabbi Shimon might be the author, and nevertheless need to teach us that in this case, the second one does not apply. Next discussion, Amar le Rav Papa le Abaye, Yisrael ba lachoto zona mashvela, halala mashvela, ola mashvela. So Rav Papa asks Abaye, if a Yisrael has relations with his own sister, so certainly, besides the prohibition of karet, also causes her to become a zonah. She will have a zonah status after that. The question is, everybody agrees to that. The question is, will she also become a halala or not, or only a zonah? here's the two sides. If a woman who violates a chayave lavin, that would be those that apply to a kohen to a gerusha. That's a isur lav, and that prohibited relations causes her to be a halala. If she becomes a halala from isur lav, then all the more so from isur karet. A brother and sister is isur karet. So in that case, the answer would be yes. She becomes a zona and a halala. Or dilma en halala ela meisur kehuna. Or do we say no? Halala is a special status that only results from a prohibition that relates to kohanim. Even if she does every incest in the whole world and brother and sister and all that, those are isur karet. Those apply to non-kohanim as well as to kohanim. And so even though that's isur karet, it makes her zona, but not halala. Halala can only result in prohibitions that relate to kohanim. That's the question, and Abaye answers, Amale en halala ela meisur kiuna bilbad. In fact, the second one, halala is a special status that applies only if someone violates a prohibition that relates to kohanim specifically, then the woman in that relationship becomes a halala. Amarava, menaha mileta d'amurabanan en halala ela meisur kiuna. Rava says, what's the source of this law that halala is only from isur kiuna? Tanya. Lo yomar girusha bekohen gadol vetete bekal vachomer mikohen hedyot. Ve'ana amina hashta lekohen hedyot asura lekohen gadol miba'ya. Lama ne'emra keshem shehaluka girusha mizona v'chalala bekohen hedyot kahaluka bekohen gadol. Okay, well, let's look at the Pesukim to understand what we're talking about here. In chapter 21, it talks about first prohibitions regarding a regular Kohen and then a Kohen Gadol. So for a Kohen Gadol, it says all four together. Almana, Ugrusha, Halala, Zona. All these people, Kohen Gadol cannot marry. And if he does, Lo Yechalel Zar'o, he should do that so that his children won't become halalim. If he does, then they will become halalim. That's Kohen Gadol. It has all four categories together. But if we look up a little bit regarding a regular Kohen, it says here, Isha Zona v'halalo lo yikachu, and then stop. And the separate statement, Isha Gerusha Meisha Lo Yikachu. So first of all, obviously it doesn't have Almana, because this is for talking about a regular Kohen who can marry an Almana. But curiously, it says Zona and Halala together, and then it says Gerusha separately, as a separate prohibition. So we're wondering, number one, why is it separate? We're going to say because it's teaching that one can be liable for multiple prohibitions. If someone is a zona and also gerusha, multiple prohibitions, multiple liability. So that's why it's separated here. But the other question is, if it already said that every kohen is prohibited zona, halala, and gerusha, why do you need to say again for kohen gadol, gerusha, halala, and zona? I already know a kohen gadol is also a kohen. You should just say almana, just add that. Why do you need all these other ones? So that's what we're going to go through and ask about each one. Okay, so here's the Braita. The Braita says the Torah doesn't need to talk about the Kohen Gadol regarding a Gerusha, prohibition of Gerusha regarding Kohen Gadol, because I can learn it from a Kal Vachomer, from a regular Kohen. If a regular Kohen can't marry a Gerusha, then also all the more so a Kohen Gadol, right? And I'll say Kohen Gadol is prohibited. Kohen Gadol, do I have to bother? So why is it said? And the answer is for that separation, just like there's a separate liability of Gerusha besides Zona and Halala for a regular Kohen. If a regular Kohen has relations with someone who's a Gerusha and a Zona and Halala, he'll be liable for each one separately. So the word Gerusha is repeated for Kohen Gadol to teach me that a Kohen Gadol also, if he is with someone who's Gerusha and other prohibitions, that he will be liable for each and every one, as we said earlier, as long as it's in that order, almana, gerusha, and so on. Now we say peshita, migra, gara'ah. Wait a second, that would be obvious. Would you think a Kohen Gadol should have any less prohibitions than a regular Kohen? A Kohen Gadol, after all, was a regular Kohen. So certainly, if a regular Kohen is liable to multiple liability, so then also a Kohen Gadol also should be liable for multiple prohibitions. Ela keshem shechaluka גירושה מזונה וחללה בכהן הדיוט, כך אלמנה חלוקה מגירושה וחללה זונה בכהן גדול. Rather, it's teaching an extra chidush. Just like for a regular kohen, there are separate prohibitions for girusha, zona, and halala. So too for a kohen gadol, where we're adding almana, don't think that almana would not also apply for a kohen gadol. Not so. We're repeating the girusha from in the case of Kohen Gadol to tell me that just like for a regular Kohen, all the prohibitions that apply to him can apply in a multiple way and get multiple punishments. So to Kohen Gadol, if she's an almana and the Gerusha, that also would be 2 or 3 or 4. Depending on the scenario. Okay, so that's what that's teaching. That's not what we need. That's not why we brought this braita. We brought the braita for this statement. Halala lama ne'emra. Why bother repeating halala? You already said that a regular kohen is prohibited halala. Why do you have to say so for kohen gadol? And the answer is, en halala ela misur kehuna. It's repeating it to tell me this very point, the whole point that we are trying to prove here, that one becomes a halala only if it's a prohibition that relates to Kohanim specifically. Zona lama ne'emra. And now, so we're continuing to the rest of them. Why mention zona twice if a regular Kohen also is already prohibited? Nemar kan zona, nemar lehalan zona, ma kan zar'o cholin, had lehalan zar'o cholin. It says regarding a regular Kohen zona, and it says also Kohen Gadol zona. Just like over here, the children are profaned, so too regarding a regular kohen, the children are profaned, right? And so here lo yichalel, that's chol, become profaned, become non-holy. It only says that this statement regarding kohen gadol, and so as a gezerah shava, it repeats zona here to tell me that just like over here, if a kohen gadol as in this prohibited relationship, the children will become halalim, so too a regular kohen also will become halalim. Okay, good. So now we learned a fantastic baraita that teaches us all about the repetitions, and we learn within this the fact that halala is only resultant from isur kehuna. And final statement, Amar Rav Ashi hilkach kohen haba al achoto zona meshvele halala la meshvele hazaru ba aleha asaa halala. Rav Ashi learns that therefore, since we have what comes above, if you have a Kohen who has relations with his sister, so she will become a zona. As we said before, any kind of prohibited relations causes a woman to become a zona, but not a halala, because the prohibition of brother and sister is not in isur kehuna. It applies to everyone. So she'll become a zona, but not a halala. However, hazaru ba'aleha, if that same brother or anyone else then has relations with this woman, since she's already a zona, and the zona is not allowed to be with any kohen, so if any kohen, including the brother or anyone else, has relations with her, so that is an isur kehuna. A kohen can't be with a zona, so that relation will make her a halala. So if it was the same brother, the same guy, the brother, it will be a two-step process. The first relations make her a zona. Now that she's a zona, which is isur kehuna, the second act of relations will make her a halala. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.